Welcome to the next part of the class. In this module, we're going to be providing more information on patterns and frameworks to extend and augment the material that we'll be covering in this course. If we went back 20 years ago or so and taught this class, we'd find that there was much less material back in those days. There were some early papers on patterns. Peter Code had published a paper in 1992. Ralph Johnson had published a paper about documenting frameworks with patterns in 1992. And of course, the Gang of Four published their first collected paper on patterns in ECOOP in 1993. Work on frameworks goes back a little further. If you went back about 25 years ago or so, you'd see that there were some papers by Ralph Johnson and Brian Foote talking about frameworks from the 1988 timeframe. And there was a lot of classic work done by Taligent, which were some of the early promoters and evangelists for frameworks, talking about the work that they had done developing frameworks for building operating systems and user interfaces. This module provides a tour through some of the landscape of literature that's appeared over the past 2 decades. Of course, the classic works in the field we've covered in depth, the Gang of Four book and the POSA 1 book. There are also 4 other volumes of the POSA series, the Pattern-Oriented Software Architecture series. And these books talk about many other dimensions, many of which have a lot to do with concurrent and network software. For example, the POSA 2 book, which I was the first author on, talks about a pattern language for concurrent and network software. And we'll be talking about many of these patterns throughout the course. There's also a book called POSA 3, which deals with a pattern language for resource management, patterns for dealing with resources, allocating resources, deallocating resources, and so on. POSA 4 combines over 100 patterns to focus on a pattern language for distributed computing. And what makes this particularly interesting is that the real emphasis of the book is not on the individual patterns in isolation, which to some extent is the focus of POSA 1, POSA 2, and POSA 3 in the Gang of Four book, but it really focuses more on the way in which those patterns work together. So well over half the book is talking about interactions between patterns as opposed to talking about the patterns by themselves. POSA 5 provides a tour through the concept space and the foundational themes and ideas and abstractions underlying patterns and pattern languages. And it talks about relationships between patterns, pattern complements, pattern compounds, pattern sequences, and of course pattern languages. There are other books that are very important to get an architectural view of patterns. And even though the books don't have the word patterns in the title, they still deal with many of the same kinds of abstractions that we've seen in other books in the pattern body of work. One of the best examples of this particular type of book is the book Software Architecture: Perspectives on an Emerging Discipline by Shaw and Garland. And they talk about many of the fundamental patterns and architectural styles that exist in building large-scale software systems. There are also a number of other books that talk about various aspects of patterns that are worth taking a look at. The late John Blasides wrote an excellent book called Pattern Hatching, which grew out of some columns he'd written for the C++ Report magazine while I was the editor. And many of these patterns either were patterns that didn't make it into the Gang of Four book because they were incomplete at the time, but he completed, or there are additional patterns that he described based on his experience applying the Gang of Four patterns in different contexts. For example, the discussion about destroying singletons was something that came out after he wrote the Gang of Four patterns. There's also a number of patterns in other domains pertaining to distributed computing and middleware. There's a book on patterns for programming J2EE. There's patterns for enterprise integration. There's even patterns about component middleware and patterns for brokers and patterns for remoting that are worth looking at. There's also patterns for how to program parallel and distributed systems, trying to take advantage of multi-core and multi-processor hardware effectively. There's patterns for trying to build systems that will be resilient in the face of failures and attacks. And there's also patterns that deal with how to write code that will be secure, to be able to operate even when you have adversaries that are trying to break into your system and attack your network, steal your data, and so on. One of the things that happened when I first got involved with patterns in the 1994 timeframe was we had a series of conferences called Pattern Languages of Programming. And these conferences would bring together both experts and novices for several days at Allerton Park in Illinois, where we would sit together and work on how to improve the way we were documenting our designs and our architectures and our software structures. And from these conferences came a series of books that collected together revised and edited versions of the papers from these conferences that are now known as the Pattern Languages of Program Design, or Plopp series of books. And there are 5 of these in all. And they give you a nice kind of broad view of the thinking of the pattern community from 1994 to about the 2000 timeframe. There are also some excellent books for people who are trying to build software that have to run in unusual or constrained environments, so-called small memory software, which is often the case for embedded systems, which don't have the luxury of gigabytes worth of memory, or high-speed processors, or unlimited power. And of course, one of the other classic books in the field of concurrency for patterns is Doug Lee's book on concurrent programming in Java, which talks about many of the different ways of trying to devise Java concurrent programs and many of the patterns for effective use of Java. You'll find that many of the ideas that are documented as patterns in Doug Lee's book have found their way into the Java class libraries for concurrency, as well as into frameworks we've talked about, such as Android. If you take a look at the Hillside website, which is dedicated to all things patterns, you'll find a more extensive list of many of the books related to the patterns community and work on patterns and the body of knowledge of patterns. There are also a number of books on frameworks. One of the early contributions of frameworks, as I mentioned before, was from the Taligent Group, which was a company that was building frameworks to try to encapsulate low-level operating system details and provide higher-level programming abstractions to make it easier to build applications. And there's a book called Inside Taligent by Cotter and Patel that has a nice chapter that describes the philosophy of frameworks that came with the approach that they were doing. There's also a series of books that were published with some colleagues of mine relating to building patterns and applying patterns in the form of frameworks, having frameworks applied in domain-specific ways, frameworks applied in more generic ways, and so on. And you might want to take a look. These are collections of papers from people who had experience either building or trying to apply frameworks in practice. Speaking of applying patterns and frameworks in practice, along the way over the past 20 years or so, I've also developed a large number of frameworks heavily driven by patterns. Many of those patterns were documented in the POSIT 2 book, but I've also published a series of books that talk about the application of these patterns in the ACE framework environment. And so you might want to take a look at some of the books that describe the frameworks that are used in ACE. I mentioned before the Pattern Languages of Programming Conference, Plopp, which started in 1994. It's been ongoing over the years and in fact is now generalized and grown beyond its initial focus in the US in Allerton Park to be an international sequence of conferences that take place in Germany, South America, Scandinavia, and other parts of the world. And the main benefit of going to a Plopp conference is it gives a chance for pattern authors to get feedback on the patterns that they're writing down from experts in the form of something called a writer's workshop. A writer's workshop is a format derived from the poetry and writing community where you have people sit around in a circle, listen carefully to a description of the pattern or the work that's being discussed, and then they take turns providing feedback to the author, things that worked, things that didn't work, things they liked, things that could be improved, and it provides invaluable feedback to people who are trying to codify their design expertise and write it down and disseminate it in pattern form. There's also a series of information about pattern conferences that's also found on the Hillside website. There's also a set of mailing lists if you'd like to learn more about patterns. There's mailing lists that talk about the Gang of Four patterns, the various Siemens POSA patterns, patterns for interprocess communication, patterns for business, and other kinds of topics. And if you take a look at the Hillside website, you'll find a way to subscribe to the mailing lists that are of interest to you. And finally, I have also produced quite an amount of information over the years that I make available on patterns and frameworks through my website at Vanderbilt. I have some information here that talks about the books I've written on patterns and frameworks, the presentations that I've recorded in either podcast or video form on patterns and frameworks. I've also taught many courses on patterns and frameworks at the various universities I've been a faculty member of. All that material, the slides, the assignment descriptions, and the syllabi and so on are all available online. And of course, I've not just talked about patterns and frameworks, I've also built and helped to build millions of lines of code, largely written in C++, some written in Java, that implement many of these patterns in frameworks that you can download and apply and use in your projects. So take a look at my website, explore the links, and feel free to use this material in a way that you see fit to make your projects more effective.